Welcome to the Double D Do Business podcast by RLC with your hosts, Dave Evans and Debbie Halls-Evans, where they meet each week with guests and discover ways you can help yourself and others become best version businesses, teams, and people.
Welcome back to season 3, Debbie. Can you believe it?
Yes, I can.
3 whole seasons. You know, for years we procrastinated with doing this, didn't we? Well, actually, I did. It was me, wasn't it?
No, the reason why you procrastinated is because you wanted all the kit, and you don't need a massive amount of kit.
You actually need hardly any kit to run a podcast. So, season 3, Debbie, we've got another special guest with us. Who is it?
Why don't you ask him?
No, I thought you were going to ask him.
Brian, why don't you introduce yourselves? We know who you are, but everybody else doesn't.
Hello, you guys. My name is Brian Wright, out of the state of Michigan in the United States. 20 years of industry knowledge within the tax and accounting industry, and done lots of research and working within the community regarding diversity and inclusion.
Which is the exciting bit that I really want to dive into and explore with you, because I think it's not only is it pertinent right now in society, but I actually think as human beings to human beings, this is how we should operate business. So I think we're going to have a really exciting chat today.
And one of the things that I'd like to explore with both you and Debbie to start with, leading into this, Brian, is we live in a global planet, right?
Right.
Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. I don't know where this is going, Brian. I don't know where it's going.
We call it Earth. Isn't that true?
We do,
right?
Yeah.
So by default, if you were being purely historical or geographical, Earth is Earth in the solar system, scientific even.
Yes.
Right? So what is it about global communities that we can't be actually communities? What is it about this global Earth thing that we all think where we're from is more important, better, different, bigger, worse than the next community, the next town, the next country, the next continent? Why can't we sort this out?
Are you actually asking Brian and I just...
That's a great question. I'll chime in on that. I have a theory behind it. I think it all has to do with media. In the age of technology, the way that information is shared, I think we start to lose the ability to think for ourselves and think logically for ourselves. And so you try to pigeonhole or put people into boxes, and therefore you start creating a bit of divisiveness or judgment, if you would.
Yeah.
Again, we get tons of information, and all of us like that information, but you have to step out of it and be able to process it as your own, you know? I think that's one of the biggest things that we're facing right now.
Well, and I also think I totally agree with you. I wrote a big post about the media a while ago, and I totally agree that we seem to lose our option of choice, or we give that power to somebody else, and actually taking that power back. Dave always says it's like, oh, you're giving the car keys over, take the car keys back. It's your car, drive it yourself.
Right.
But I also think there is an element as well of ego, and I think ego is the part of it from a global community perspective, particularly in business, is where we allow others' egos to rule, and actually we should all be equal and treated as equal, and we don't allow that to happen.
I also think as well, Brian, that we don't appreciate the scars of time. So if you think about elitism, oppression, you know, historical disasters, things that went on over hundreds of years in our past, we don't appreciate the effect of them in the modern day. There was a quote recently, wasn't there, on BBC Radio 4 by Winston Churchill's granddaughter. She said we were obsessed by judging judging today through the prism of the past. I thought, what an interesting viewpoint.
Right. And I think that goes into accepting differences as well. I mean, going back to the ego thing, right? You're always trying to outdo somebody, you're trying to fit in some way or another. And I find that now when people are faced with choices, it's an either or. You're either on this side or that side, right? It's not embracing the differences of saying, hey, I feel this way and you feel that way. Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. That curiosity factor, I think, is missing from the individuals.
Yeah, I've just read there's a brilliant book by Ian Leslie called Curious, and it's a fantastic book, and it explores just that whole context in regards to is that we are so forced and pushed, which again goes back to ego, media, all the things we've just been talking about. But we also don't encourage curiosity, because that means that we have to, as an individual, we have to accept that there's something we don't know.
Right.
And I don't like not knowing.
Right.
Debbie thinks I was writing something down for her to read. No,
Right,
it's my note.
Okay.
I think, Brian, let's draw that out for a second. I think it is a curiosity. A couple of years ago, we went on a Sport FM surf holiday, didn't we? Two lads from Cornwall who'd set up a surfing holiday. We were in Morocco. And you took me instantly to a place in the past where we were in this tiny village that didn't have tourism, which is why the two chaps, Maleft, way off the beaten track in Morocco. And at one point in the trip, we were in the mayor's house, right? And let's put it into context. It's not like the mayor of New York or the mayor of London. The mayor of a village has not got very much money. So we were in his house. He was in his early 30s, right? And they'd put on this fresh sea barbecue, and we were hanging out with them. They were proper curious about who we were. We were curious about who they were. There was a guitar playing. We were singing. At least Debbie was. I think she was singing, right? On reflection now, looking back, it might have been the wind. But that spirit of curiosity, which leads me to something that we said in the pre-meet of our podcast today about community. Because I still think community is the answer to a lot of our local and national problems. But capitalism in the last 40 years, I think, has genuinely stripped it back.
Okay.
I don't mean capitalism as a broad generalization.
It's a very broad statement, Dave.
Well, if you think about in Britain, all the community things that, the street parties, Debbie's from the past, those things don't happen that often, if ever, in most villages and towns up and down the country in the UK anymore. Why? There's no desire to do it, that curiosity. So I think we've got to bring community back. And so it takes me to my next question to Brian and to you, Debbie.
Great.
How do you cross the bridges that are, how do you build a bridge in community to go from one side to the other? What are your best thoughts on that? I'm curious, using the curious word again.
That word's going to be used quite a bit. I'm glad you asked that question. Here in the United States, I say that a lot. The last few elections have been very polarizing. And again, it's an either or. You're either on this side or that side. And what I always say is, at the end of the day, I don't care who's sitting in our presidential office, right? Because we are the people that make up the community. And that goes back to that curiosity piece. We're the ones that shape the community that we live in. And so if we embrace some of those competencies that we talked about, as far as being curious, just listening and trying to understand different perspectives, then I think that's how you truly change things. I think a lot of times we read the media or we listen to the news, and then we expect our local politicians to do certain things or to lead by example. And sometimes that may be, the wrong expectations to put on them, but we have to have that ownership, and we have to take our part as a community to say, hey, I'm noticing this, now I choose to do something different. Let me learn a little bit more about that, right?
Yeah, and I also think what's really interesting is with curiosity, one of its bedfellows is also fear. So by being curious, I can also create my own fear. So curiosity forces us to be courageous and brave and actually push ourselves. I think once you start being curious, I think it does trigger something inside you that you want to keep going and keep going. But it's actually, how do you trigger it? How do we trigger? And it goes back to what you said earlier, which I thought was great, was stop seeing or stop not seeing the differences that each of us has to offer. And this, to me, it crosses everything from gender to race to politics to religion. I think it's actually, we have to embrace those differences. I don't even need to like you. What I do need to do is I need to respect that you are different than me and your experiences are different. And even if we've experienced the same experience, I've talked about when I lost my husband, and I always say, I can't then go and say to somebody, I know how you feel. I have no idea, because I'm not them. So we have to force that curiosity to say, tell me, Brian, tell me how you run your business. Let me understand how I can run my business. How do they work in synergy together in your community? We don't ask those questions, do we? We kind of just blinker ourselves down and kind of like, if I start saying something, oh, they're different than me, it's like suddenly I've got to deal with my own fear, when actually, when humans get together and they are curious and open, it's incredible conversation and incredible work happens, but we just don't seem to do it very well.
You know, Debbie, you hit on a couple good points. Earlier, you talked about the ego, and I think what you're talking about now is just being vulnerable, right? And I think that's okay. Being vulnerable to say, it's okay that you don't know. I say that all the time. Me being a Black man, I say, I don't expect Dave to know what it's like to walk in my shoes, right? And I don't fault you for that. I tell my wife, I love women, but I have no idea what it's like to be a woman. I have no idea what it's like. And I think that's the first step. So I know specifically when you're dealing with race, that's a tough one for people to grasp and become vulnerable, because nobody wants to be labeled as a racist. But you got to step out of it and say, we all have our own biases. It doesn't mean that you're a racist, but you have to start by being vulnerable and being curious in order to learn. And then that creates that environment where you can engage and start to embrace the different cultures, the different lifestyles, the different genders, whatever the case may be. I think I'm a pretty open-minded person, but I'm ignorant to so many things. And I'm okay with that because I'm curious to learn, right?
Yeah. And I think, do you know, one of the things, I mean, again, I've talked about it since probably the past 10 years or so, is we are living in a revolution. I genuinely believe we are. I think the last revolution we had globally was the Industrial Revolution, and we haven't had one since, you could say, the technology revolution of kind of 25 years ago. But I do think that revolution is fundamental, groundbreaking change, and that change is, and I know it's taken a long time to get here.
It's the actual, I think the revolution we're in right now today is the data revolution, because data is, I think 3-4 months ago, for the first time ever, became the most valuable asset on the planet.
Yeah.
More than oil, more than water, data.
But then that, okay, so two things, just say data to me in a minute, because I want to just stick on this point, was about
data to me in a minute.
Yes. In regards
that's what you asked for, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, but I consider myself as somebody who is knowledgeable. Very what you said about, you know, I don't know what I don't know. And I actually thought I knew a lot about Black history. I knew where it started from. I did the whole Martin Luther King. I know this, I know. I actually know zero, squat, nothing. And one of the things I have thoroughly enjoyed and also scared myself in the process is understanding how little I know of other communities and other societies and other cultures. And that what I'm getting out, I'm the one, and it's very individualistic, but I am the one that's getting something out of that. I then need to understand how I go and use it to benefit others. So, because it has to start with the individual, doesn't it? It doesn't matter, you know, I can't go and I can't force my kids to change their opinion, but I can say, have you read this? Do you understand this? Go and explore this.
Have you taken a different perspective? You know, when we run our fire starter programs, we always talk about taking at least 3 or 4 perspectives to get a better informed decision. In fact, we go as far as coaching leaders to do that today. Who are your 3 or 4 people who have completely different views, who are around you to help you make better choices? I think it's taking a balanced view of things, I think, helps quite a bit.
But we still don't do it. So why don't we do it?
Well, I think that's the big part is again, when it's easy to point out the problem. And like right now, there's tons of protests going on around the world. And I think it's great from an awareness perspective, but a lot of the symbolic gestures, meaning people can go to a protest and then come back and say, oh, I'm not biased, I protest, right? But when it comes to that individual saying, hey, you are guilty of some of these microaggressions or some of these things that make people feel out of place, then the walls come up, right? And people stop being curious at that point, because now you're talking about them personally. And that's where I always challenge people and say, you know, it's great that we show out here, but what's your level of commitment? Because are you willing to admit and look in the mirror that, hey, there's some things that I can do differently? None of us are perfect, we're humans, right? So we start there. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of energy around the protest and things, but when you get down to the fundamentals about you as your core and being self-aware enough to say, hey, I may need to change my behaviors, or I may need to be aware that when I say these things, it impacts this person this way. Doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it means that you have to have that personal commitment in order to influence change. I think that's the biggest obstacle that we have. I think right now we have tons of awareness of the issues that are going on around the world. But where we're lacking is the personal commitment, because it's easy to point the finger and say, someone needs to fix that, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But don't change my life. Don't change my world. I don't want to lose anything. And it's like, you're not losing anything. You're gaining, right? Gaining insights from a different perspective. I'd like to share one thing that I talk about in the community, because we've dealt with some things here in my local community here in Michigan. My son was a victim of racism. There are some racist chats that were going around calling him the N-word and some very blatant things. And so through that process, we worked as a community with the school board system, as well as the local community with the police department and the mayor and so on. And the way that I explain it is, we start talking about education and Black history. And sometimes people think, yes, there was slavery, there's a civil rights movement, and now we're here, things are better. I'm like, no, you got to look at it from a generational perspective. So for me, I'm 45 years old. My mother was born in the South in the United States, where there was segregation. She wasn't allowed to go to schools because she was Black. She wasn't allowed to drink in drinking fountains. She wasn't allowed to sit on the front of the bus. She marched with Martin Luther King. That's my mom. We're not talking 400 years ago, right? That is one generation. So when I talk about the incident with my son, who's 16, by the way, my mom was really hurt. She said, hey, I dealt with this as a kid. I thought we were beyond that. And here my 16-year-old is dealing with the same type of environment that she dealt with during her high school career. So yes, we are not slaves anymore. Yes, there are some rights that are in place, but when you start looking at the generation, right? Your parents shaped you and who you are, just as my mother shaped me and who I am, right? So you have to think about that impact. The other thing that I worked with within a community was to talk about the impact to the victim, because oftentimes we look at the offender and say, oh, this person is going to be suspended or educated or expelled or whatever the case may be. But what you have to think about, when it first started with my son, he was 13 years old.
Yeah.
So think about being 2% of the population in his school, being called the N-word, nothing really happening to that individual. And then, oh, by the way, I want you to stand up in class and give a speech, right? So you have to think about that impact and that burden that these children are carrying when they're faced with that racism, and how it impacts their education when it's in the school system, how it impacts their view on society when it's out in the community, right? These are things that people carry, and then they carry into adulthood, which impacts them in the workplace as well, right? So sometimes you may see the reaction, but you may not understand the history of how many incidents or instances this has happened to that individual, which then makes them, react the way that you may be seeing.
So does that mean, and again, I think this is fascinating, so to be able to work with and alongside, because I think this is where we also get confused with linguistics, is that we say, we should all work together. Going back to your point, why would we do that sometimes? Because I've got all of this history of abuse, neglect, ignorance, issue, undermining my own ability, but actually we then suddenly turn around, right, we're all going to work together now. Isn't this fantastic? Isn't it lovely? Because that's not real life either, is it? So it's the other thing that is fascinating me is, how do we do that? How do we have, and it's not, I don't believe it's even empathy, because I believe empathy is such an over-abused word in regards to is, oh, I really understand. I don't understand. Like you said before, you don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be a man. So I'm not sure it's empathy. I think the words I really liked about was, how do we each individually make a personal commitment that allows us to work better together across communities? Because I'm not in your community, you're not in mine. So how do we do that? What are those things? Like you said, education is key. What else do we need to do?
I think awareness is key, right? First, becoming aware. And the big thing to that is, even right now, when we talk about Black history, it's always like you're trying to prove a point that it still exists. That's how I feel, right? And one of the things that I always say is, your feelings are your feelings. Mm-hmm. No one can tell you that they're right or wrong, and we have to accept that. If I were to say something to you that was offensive, it's not my job to debate and try and change your mind that you're not offensive, that you're not offended, right? It's in, oh, Debbie, I'm sorry I said that. That wasn't my intent. I'll be more careful. I'll use an example. I'm a football guy, so coaching kids, I'm like, oh, you throw like a girl, right? And being in corporate America, I'm like, oh, you threw that shot like a girl, playing basketball at the garbage. And someone told me that was offensive. I said, oh, I've been saying that my whole life and never thought it was offensive, but I stopped because It's not offensive to me, but if it's offending someone else, then it's not my job to tell them that they're wrong. And so that goes back to being vulnerable and being curious about that and say, oh, well, let me understand that. And this individual that told me that, we had other conversations and there were other things that led up to that, but nonetheless, it's owning their feelings. So you asked a question about how do we do that? First thing, there's no silver bullet, but I think as individuals, we have to stop letting our egos get in the way of trying to convince people that they're wrong and that we're right. Yeah. And really embrace the differences in what you're hearing. If someone is courageous enough to tell you that you hurt their feelings or that you're offended, accept it, right? And maybe ask the question, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intent. Why does that offend you? Or something to that effect. But I think it opens up the dialogue and then you become better at it. I think you also have to be courageous enough to call it out when you see it. So as you learn, you're in these environments and other people do these things, calling it out. It doesn't have to be combative, but having a conversation, I think those are some of the things that we can do to empower individuals to really make a difference, because that's where it starts. It starts with the individuals. There's no rules, there's no policies, there's no laws, there's no holiday that's going to fix the situation. It's us as individuals that have to step back and say, hey, let me be curious rather than trying to win that conversation.
And it's like you said earlier on, because one of the words I wrote down was, we're all in this for the long term. This is not just our generation, it's the next generation and the next generation. And we have to be prepared for that too, don't we? We have to be prepared that, I had a discussion with somebody the other day, I said, but it's been going on for centuries. I went, so that doesn't mean anything. It means that we should be doing something. We should have at least learned something. And then there is, we have progressed very, very slowly, may I say, but we have progressed from where we were. So, whether that's taken 400 years, it's going to take us another 400 years. I don't know in society. I genuinely believe that we're going to move a lot faster.
But I also think, Debbie, we can be slightly more challenging, right? I think, go back to the beginning of this conversation. We live in a digital-centric world. We live with more access to more information than ever before. And yeah, we know that's abused by robots. And I mean, fake social media accounts and some of the stuff you see that goes on in the news, whether it's true or not, is another question, right? But if pause there's also a lot of good. We got to give more airtime to where good
the media.
Totally, where good exists. We also have the best opportunities in the world to do a really great job with tomorrow's generations, where they can grow up not carrying the paradigms and the challenges that we have seen or still know exist today, and they can grow into the world without them. But that comes back to something that you said a minute ago, Brian, personal commitment. That's personal commitment from teachers, parents, neighborhoods, communities, governments, countries, right? To say enough's enough. The next 3-year-old going into kindergarten is going to be taught the right way. And it's going to be the most important thing that we instill, teach, and deliver.
Absolutely. I think you hit an important point, David, and that's something that's hard to swallow for a lot of people. I've done a lot of work with diversity and inclusion and equity, right? And I make a statement of saying that I don't believe that I'm going to see the change that I want in my lifetime. However, I'm doing it for the generations following me. And that can sound defeating, but it's the reality of it. It's false expectations to think that next year we're going to be better. But if we know that our purpose is to create a better world for our next generations, for my kids, my grandkids, what have you, and if we all have that personal commitment to do our part, then we can move that needle much faster. But to say, hey, this doesn't exist, that was, 400 years ago or 100 years ago, or you're overreacting, or Debbie, you're being too sensitive about women's rights, right? That's just dismissive and it's not moving the needle. But if we can acknowledge that and start to change our behaviors, and like you said, embed it in our children, right? That's how you start to move that needle. I think the other thing, going back to the data and the media, information is great. It's great. But what you find is that a lot of people own the narrative that they see on the media, right? And that's why I tell those people, they'll say, well, this is happening. I'm like, yeah, but have you experienced it?
Yeah.
It's okay to be aware that things are happening, but you have to judge people based off of your interaction with those people. Not all cops are bad, right? Not all black people are criminals. Not all women are weak, right? So these are just stereotypes that are perpetuated sometimes by people owning narratives. So that goes back to saying, hey, you have to own your own feelings, and you have to own your own ability to be curious and learn about these things and create your own opinion and bring that insight into a conversation. I think those ingredients will actually move the conversation forward. If I watch the news and watch the media and I go out in the world owning everything, then I won't talk to anybody because it's nasty, right? And we all know that's not true. There's more good than evil that's out there, right?
Yeah, I can only agree, which I think is always a nice place to be when you're a guest on a podcast.
Just to remind our listeners, you're back listening to Double D New Business. This is season 3, and we are jumping right into the deep end today, talking with Brian about some real diversive issues. But what I also like about our conversation so far today is that all of what we've talked about is replicatable to leadership, to coaching, to great human interactions. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the issues in the world, it's actually just having a much better interest in the world also. Would you agree?
Yeah, he's very good at this summary, isn't he, Brian? He kind of just suddenly throws it at us and we kind of go, yeah, that's such a good point. That is a good point. But yes, and it is, well, we have to be better people at every level. And I think we've got to step into other people's communities and go back to being curious, being accepting, understanding our differences. And actually, even before you get to the understanding, just accept the differences exist. That's, I think if we can even move the dial that little bit towards that, instead of pretending that they don't, because ultimately that's the reason why we're in this situation. People have spent decades, for all of the oppression and everything that's happened in society, we've still spent decades and decades and decades ignoring it. You know, you even said about your mum, I thought this had, moved on. Well, actually, no, it hasn't. You know, it just so happens it's going to be diluted in certain fields, and over here it's going to be talked about more. Well, actually, it should be something we universally get better at. We get better at being uncomfortable, and we get better at not knowing what we don't know, and we get better at just working with other people. What are you laughing at?
I'm loving your gestures. It's really quite
right.
I feel like going, yeah.
I think you're dead on, Dave. Dave, you said something earlier about it being duplicatable, and I totally agree. Within the community that I'm working in, when you think about all the various causes and groups that are of the marginalized groups, you have the LGBTQ community, you have women's rights, you have the Black community, you have the Hispanic community, what have you. And working with the school board, it was a bit of paralysis. So how do you solve for all these things, right? Because everybody has different things and initiatives. So how do you do that?
Yeah.
And the biggest thing to that is, one, understanding there's no silver bullet. It's not going to happen overnight. But two, what we decided to focus on is the incident that spurred a lot of this change was a racial incident targeted towards Black and brown kids. And our focus, we have a group called the Celine Parents Against Racism. Our focus is on making a safe learning environment for Black and brown kids. And if we focus there, then it's rinse and repeat, and you can spread it across all the various groups. Because it really comes down to basic things that your mom and dad taught you, right? Be kind, be nice, right?
Yeah.
But all of those underlying elements, everything that we talked about, being vulnerable, being curious, being mindful, respecting other people's feelings and not trying to change their mind, that's applicable across the board. So if we can create an environment and we start to say that there's zero tolerance for these things, then people will naturally start to treat people the way that they should be treated, right? But when you have all of these various initiatives that are coming up, it can create a bit of paralysis, and that's where people are, you get turned off.
Well, I suppose that goes back to your point of where people then, they do protest, which is, I think, awesome. And then they come home and they feel like they've put their hand up and they've done something, but it's continue to do something. We can't, whether there's a next progression to protesting, and actually that's proactivity in doing something consistently every single day to move each one of us forward. And I think that's the bit we get lost in, which is a great word, paralysis, is we then get stuck because that active collective, I feel part of something, but suddenly I've now got to do it on an individual level, and what is it that I need to do?
The tip to paralysis is move. And I know that sounds almost the wrong thing to say, because paralysis defines you are stuck. You're stuck when you give paralysis time. Paralysis is the clue, it's a symptom that says, I got to act now. There's no tomorrow, later this afternoon. It is immediately. Because then as soon as you do that, whatever you do next, assuming it's a right motivated action, the paralysis is instantly ceased. You might not get it right, but you didn't stay where you were, which is more damaging. So paralysis in business is a clue to act. And it's also the same in communities. Do something, because if you do nothing and that paralysis sticks, you're in a lot of trouble in any situation. Now, we are coming up towards the end of the podcast.
Can I know one thing I want to ask Brian?
Of course you can, Debbie.
So just going back to what you said before, because I absolutely love this point. So because there is activity that has to happen, we have to move forward. We have to, like David said, take action now. But then we create these different elements, groups, support groups, activities, all these things. But then we make things more exclusive, because ultimately our goal is to be inclusive, therefore accepting, tolerating, not necessarily having to like, but knowing we are all different. How do we do that? And in business, it fascinates me, because I've written about this many, many times, is that when we become inclusive, we then actually act exclusively, because we start isolating and our labels get bigger, and we start saying, well, you're of that group, so you should go there, Brian. Oh, and by the way, Debbie, you're white female, so you should go over there. And actually we stop the inclusivity, but going back to the point, all with positive intent.
So what's your question to Brian, Debbie?
How do we stop inclusivity becoming exclusive? Huge question, sorry, just thought I took it in the air.
Question that's still continuously debated. So I'll share my experiences. So I started the Black Employee Network with my former employer, place of employment. That was one group. We had the women, that was another group. We also had a pride group. So we had the various groups. The same is true within the community. And what I found was that because I started the Black Employee Network, it was not exclusive to Blacks. It was allies are welcome as well. As a matter of fact, the majority of the members were actually non-Black. They were white, right? With that, we had similar initiatives as the other groups. So what we did was take the leadership of each of those groups and kind of come together to bring some commonality. Because it's difficult, just because I started the Black Employee Network, I support each and every group, and I would try to go to their events, but it's impossible to be everywhere, right, all the time. So some of the things that we've done, or that I've done within the corporate world as well as within the community, is to create a steering committee, right? So you have those groups that are targeted towards those initiatives or those things that are impacting the Black environment, the women's environment, the LGBTQ environment. But you bring them all together to talk about those things so you can share and leverage best practices. Because one group may be doing something really well that you can piggyback off of and maybe join in joint partnership. Because again, some of the underlying results and actionable things are the same. That same thing happened within the community. We had several different groups, and it's impossible for the mayor and the superintendent to be at all of these meetings. So you bring together a steering committee that focuses on actionable items. I can't stress enough, if we're talking about in a community or in a corporate or a work environment, having those groups, it is imperative that you start to talk about the actions that you can take. Because it's very easy to get there and talk about all the problems, but usually when you're disappointed, it's because you didn't get the desired result that you wanted. So what is it that you want? And start focusing on what's the action that you can actually take. And that's when you start moving in. It's not going to be perfect, but you got to start somewhere. But so far that's worked both in the corporate world as well as the community, of having the individual groups so that people have a safe space to express their concerns, right? I had concerns about going to a pride network because I'm not a gay individual, but I was also welcome. They said, no, we like your perspective and you're welcome there to learn. I'm like, great. People had the same concerns with coming to the Black Employee Network. I'm not Black. I don't want to take away from the Black employees sharing their thoughts. No, you're welcome, because if we can bring about awareness and bring about different perspectives, then we have more allies to help move that needle.
Okay, that's awesome.
So
thank you.
Again, if you're listening to WD Business, there is a blueprint in here today that you could take loads of advice from in order to start a movement in your town, in your business, in your communities that you're part of. Do listen back and take note of the immense things that we've discussed in this episode. A huge thank you, Brian, for joining us. had to go through this on Double D Do Business. So thank you, my friend.
No problem. Thank you guys for having me.
No, thank you.
And join us next time on Double D Do Business.
You've been listening to the Double D Do Business podcast, brought to you by RLC and sponsored by CoachPad, the coaching tool built for you, by coaches, for coaches. If you would like any assistance or help for what you've heard today, please feel free to get in touch with us at info@rlc-global.com. That's info@rlc-global.com. And we would be delighted to hear from you. Wishing you every success with your learning.